The accusation didn't happen quietly. It happened in a conference room in front of people I worked beside every day when an executive looked straight at me and said my team had cost the company over $1 million. Not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, fraud. In that moment, years of trust evaporated, and my name became the problem that needed to be erased. What they didn't realize was that the same person they tried to humiliate had been documenting everything long before that meeting. If you've ever been blamed to protect someone more powerful, this story will sound familiar. Stay with me. And if this resonates, subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. The conference room door opened harder than it needed to, and every head at the table snapped up before anyone spoke. I hadn't even sat down yet when he said my name, sharp and loud, like it had been waiting in his mouth all morning. "This stops today," he said, standing at the head of the table, one hand flat on the surface, the other already pointing in my direction. I felt the air shift before I understood why. A screen lit up behind him, numbers already highlighted in red, and he didn't bother easing into it. "We have over $1.6 million unaccounted for," he said, "and it came out of this team." Chairs creaked. Someone cleared their throat. I stayed still, because when you've done nothing wrong, you don't expect to be the target. He didn't look around the room. He looked straight at me. "You were responsible for oversight," he continued, "so explain how this happened." I opened my mouth, but he kept going. "Don't," he said, holding up a hand. "We've already reviewed the adjustments, the approvals, the reversals. This wasn't an accident." The word hung there. Fraud. He didn't say it yet, but everyone heard it anyway. I could feel people turning in their seats, glancing at me, then back at the screen, then back at me again, like the numbers might change if they looked twice. "I trusted you," he said, shaking his head, almost regretful, as if this pained him. "And now I'm finding out you either lost control of your process or deliberately ignored what was happening." Someone on the far end of the table said, "Are you saying—" He cut them off. "I'm saying the loss is traced back to approvals that went through her desk." Her, not my name this time. He had already reduced me to a role. My hands were flat on the table, palms down, because if I let them move, they might shake. "That's not accurate," I said finally. My voice sounded smaller than it should have in that room. "Those adjustments were directed." He smiled then, a thin, practiced thing. "Directed by whom?" The silence stretched just long enough to hurt. I looked around the table, at people I'd worked beside for years, people who knew how carefully I worked, how often I flagged issues no one wanted to deal with. No one met my eyes. "We'll get to that," he said, turning back to the screen. "What matters right now is accountability." He clicked to the next slide. More numbers, more red. "This kind of exposure puts the entire company at risk," he said. "And if this was intentional, there will be consequences." He let that settle before adding, "terminations, legal action, industry notification." That was the moment the room decided who I was. I could feel it happen, the distance, the judgment, the unspoken relief that it wasn't them. "You can't seriously be putting this on me," I said, louder now. "Every one of those entries has an approval chain." He nodded as if indulging me. "And we've reviewed it, which is why this is so disappointing." He turned to the others. "I wanted transparency, and instead I got deception." Someone whispered my name, too quietly to count as support. "Effective immediately," he said. "Your access is being reviewed. HR will follow up. We'll determine next steps once we understand the full scope of what you allowed to happen." Allowed. The word landed harder than fraud would have. I realized then this wasn't a question. It wasn't even an accusation looking for proof. It was a decision already made, delivered publicly so no one would challenge it later. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly enough to break the tension. "If you're accusing me of this," I said, "say it clearly." He looked surprised for a fraction of a second, then composed himself. "I'm saying this falls on you," he replied, "and will proceed accordingly." That was it. No vote, no discussion. Just my reputation stripped down to a line item on a slide. As the meeting adjourned and people filed out without looking at me, I understood something with complete clarity. This wasn't about numbers. It was about needing a name to attach them to, and mine had just been chosen. By the time I reached my desk, the damage was already spreading in ways no spreadsheet could show. Conversations stopped when I approached. Emails that normally came with quick replies sat unanswered. My calendar, usually full, began to empty itself without explanation. I logged in and noticed access delays, not full revocations yet, just enough friction to remind me I was being watched. HR didn't call, which somehow felt worse. Silence gives people room to assume the worst. I pulled up the files from the meeting, wanting to review exactly what had been shown, but the shared folder returned an error. When I refreshed, the permissions were gone, not locked out completely, just restricted enough to slow me down. That wasn't an accident. A message finally came through from my manager, short and careful. "We're aligning internally. Please don't make changes to any active records." No question, no context, just a directive. I replied with a single sentence confirming I'd received it, then stopped myself from adding anything else. Every extra word felt like it could be used later. Around me, the office kept moving. Phones rang, printers hummed. People laughed near the break area, the sound drifting over like it belonged to another place entirely. I overheard my name once, followed by a pause that told me everything. Someone else whispered, "I don't know." And then the voices dropped lower. The accusation hadn't been repeated out loud, but it didn't need to be. It had already settled into the room. An hour later, a request hit my inbox asking for a summary of recent adjustments tied to vendor reconciliations. The sender CC'd 3 people who'd never been looped into my work before. That was deliberate. It wasn't about the information, it was about creating a record that suggested cooperation after the fact. I responded with exactly what was asked for and nothing more, attaching documents that already existed, time-stamped and unedited. When I stood to deliver a printed copy to compliance, the receptionist avoided eye contact. That was new. She used to ask about my weekends. I returned to my desk and noticed someone had moved a stack of folders I kept neatly aligned, sliding them just enough to break the order. A small thing, but intentional. The message was clear. This wasn't my space anymore. Later, a colleague I'd trained leaned over and said quietly, "They're saying this goes higher than the team." I asked who they were. He shook his head. "Everyone." That word did more damage than any formal warning could have. I spent the rest of the afternoon doing what I'd always done, working carefully, documenting each action, saving copies where they belonged. I stopped speaking unless spoken to, not out of fear, but out of control. The story was already being written without me. Anything I added verbally would only be misquoted later. As the day wound down, a meeting invite appeared for the following morning. Subject line neutral, attendees expanded. That was when I understood this wasn't about resolution. It was about escalation. They weren't trying to clarify what happened. They were preparing to finalize a narrative. I shut down my computer, slid my notebook into my bag, and walked out without saying goodbye. No one stopped me. No one asked if I was okay. In the parking lot, I sat in my car longer than usual, hands on the wheel, not because I didn't know where to go, but because I was calculating the next move. The humiliation had already happened. The isolation was underway. What came next would decide whether this ended with my name quietly buried or with the truth placed exactly where it belonged. That night, I didn't go back over the meeting in my head. I didn't replay faces or tones or the moment my name was reduced to a liability. I opened my laptop and went straight to the folders I'd built quietly over months, the ones no one else had reason to know existed. Each file was labeled by date, not emotion. Each version saved before and after an adjustment, not because I expected betrayal, but because experience had taught me that memory is negotiable and records are not. I pulled up the first approval chain tied to the figure they'd waved around that morning and traced it backward, step by step, until it landed exactly where I already knew it would. A request that didn't come from me. A directive phrased as urgency. A follow-up that closed the loop without inviting questions. I didn't need to convince myself of anything. The pattern had been there long before the accusation. I moved methodically, exporting logs, copying emails, capturing screenshots that showed timestamps and permissions. Not a dump, a sequence. Anyone can overwhelm with data. What matters is showing cause and effect. I built a clean timeline that matched adjustments to instructions and instructions to names, then cross-referenced them with access rights that shifted just long enough to allow changes through. By the time I finished, the story told itself without commentary. I created duplicates and stored them in separate places, not out of paranoia, but out of habit. Systems fail. People misplace things. Redundancy is professionalism. When I finally shut the laptop, the decision was already made. The next day's meeting wasn't something to survive. It was something to walk into, prepared. I arrived early and requested the room's shared display, citing a need to clarify figures. No one objected. They rarely do when they assume you're already on the defensive. As people filtered in, I watched them scan the room the way I had the day before, looking for cues about how this would go. He arrived last, confident again, carrying a thin folder like it contained conclusions rather than assumptions. "Let's get this wrapped up," he said, sitting back. I connected my laptop without asking permission. "Before we do," I said, "I want to show how the numbers actually moved." He frowned but didn't stop me. The first screen was neutral, no accusations, just a ledger view with entries highlighted. I clicked once and the approval path appeared alongside it. Another click and the corresponding email opened. I didn't speak much. I didn't need to. The room leaned forward on its own. Someone asked a question about timing. I answered it by pulling up the log. Someone else suggested a system error. I overlaid access changes that aligned perfectly with the entries in question. He shifted in his seat. "That's selective," he said. "You're isolating pieces." I nodded. "Then let's expand." I brought up the full set. Not dramatic, just comprehensive. The air changed, not with outrage, but with calculation. People started doing math in their heads. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was directional. "These adjustments weren't authorized at my level," I said carefully. "They were instructed." He interrupted, voice sharp. "Are you accusing?" "I'm showing sequence," I replied. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't name him. I didn't have to. The sequence did it for me. A silence settled that felt different from the day before. This one wasn't avoidance. It was recognition. I closed the laptop and let the last screen hang for a moment longer than necessary. "I've shared copies with compliance," I added. "Nothing here can be altered retroactively." He looked around the table, searching for support that didn't arrive. For the first time since this began, I wasn't reacting. I was controlling pace. And that was when I knew the ground had shifted, not because I'd argued better, but because the truth had finally entered the room in a form no one could dismiss. The meeting ended without a verdict, which told me more than a decision would have. People didn't rush out this time. They lingered, gathered their things slowly, exchanged looks that said calculations were happening somewhere behind polite expressions. He stayed seated as others stood, flipping through his folder like it might offer him an exit if he read fast enough. I closed my laptop and waited until the room was nearly empty before leaving, not out of courtesy, but because timing matters when momentum shifts. By the time I reached my desk, my inbox was already filling in a different way. Requests came from departments that had never contacted me directly before. Compliance wanted clarification on approval scope. Operations asked for a reconciliation summary. Legal asked for a copy of the materials I'd referenced. None of the messages accused. None defended either. They were careful, neutral, and unmistakably serious. I responded in order, attaching the same documents I'd shown, unchanged, with short notes that did not editorialize. Each reply expanded the audience without adding a single new claim. Mid-morning, a calendar block appeared labeled Follow-Up Review. Attendees updated to include names that carried weight. He was included, but no longer listed as the organizer. That detail mattered. When we reconvened, the tone had shifted again. The questions were sharper, no longer circling me, but the process itself. Who initiated this change? Why was this override allowed? Who approved the reversal? Each answer pulled the focus away from me without my having to push it there. He tried to steer it back. This still happened under her oversight, he said, tapping the table for emphasis. Oversight doesn't mean origin, I replied, keeping my voice even. It means review. Someone else asked me to walk through escalation paths. I did, step by step, naming roles, not people. He interrupted twice and was asked to let me finish once. That had never happened before. The room began to fracture along lines of responsibility rather than loyalty. By the time the meeting adjourned, no one was talking about punishment. They were talking about exposure. After Guault, lunch security quietly changed badge permissions across the floor. Not mine, his. He noticed when his card failed at a door he'd passed through 100 times without thinking. The look on his face wasn't anger. It was surprise. Authority rarely expects friction. An email followed shortly after, announcing an internal review and instructing everyone to preserve records. The language was procedural, but the implication was loud. I was asked to join a small working group to support the review, temporary defined scope. He wasn't. When I walked past his office, the door was closed. Voices inside were low and urgent. I didn't slow down. Later, I was called into a smaller room with 2 senior leaders and asked to explain again how I'd tracked the discrepancies. I answered without embellishment. I kept records, I said. When adjustments didn't align, I saved the originals. They exchanged a look that wasn't relief so much as recalibration. Did anyone discourage you from documenting? One asked. I thought carefully before answering. I was told not to worry, I said. I worried anyway. That was enough. By late afternoon, word moved faster than official messages ever do. People stopped me in the hallway, not to apologize, but to ask questions they hadn't dared to ask before. Was this going on elsewhere? How far back does it go? I answered what I could and referred the rest to the review. I didn't speculate. Speculation would have diluted what was already strong. As the day closed, an announcement went out that he would be stepping away from certain responsibilities pending findings. The phrasing was gentle, the impact was not. His assistant cleared files from his desk while he sat rigid, staring at his screen. I packed my bag at the usual time and walked out past the glass walls that reflected a company in mid-adjustment. No one followed me. No one stopped me. The power in the building hadn't disappeared. It had simply changed hands, quietly, the way it always does when control slips not with a shout, but with proof. The final meeting wasn't announced with urgency, which is how I knew it mattered. It appeared on calendars late in the afternoon, scheduled for the next morning, labeled simply, Findings Review. By then, the building felt different, like everyone was waiting for a verdict no one wanted to predict out loud. When I walked into the room, the seating had changed. He was no longer at the head of the table. He sat along the side, closer to the door, his folder thicker than before, his posture rigid. The screen was already on, paused on a neutral slide. No numbers yet. No red. One of the senior leaders opened the meeting without preamble. "We're here to walk through conclusions," she said, "not opinions." That sentence set the tone. The first 20 minutes weren't about me. They were about process failures, control gaps, exceptions that had become habits. Names weren't used at first. Then timelines appeared, dates aligned, responsibilities narrowed. When my documentation came up, it was presented by someone else. That was deliberate. It took ownership out of it. The room watched as approval chains unfolded in sequence, instructions tied to adjustments with no interpretation required. He shifted again, leaned forward. "This still doesn't prove intent," he said. His voice carried less weight than it used to. "It shows judgment calls." The response came immediately. "It shows direction," another executive replied. "Repeated direction." Silence followed, heavy and complete. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The facts were doing the work. When the question finally turned to me, it wasn't accusatory. When did you realize the pattern? I answered plainly, when the same explanation was used more than once. Why didn't you escalate sooner? I documented first. No one challenged that. He tried once more, a last attempt to pull the room back toward uncertainty. Oversight failed, he said, glancing at me. That's the core issue. The chair didn't look at him when she responded. Oversight flagged, she said. Origin concealed. That was it. The distinction settled like a final stamp. The conclusion wasn't shouted, it was read from a prepared page. He was being relieved of his role, effective immediately. Access suspended, responsibilities reassigned, further review pending. The words were measured, professional, irreversible. He stood abruptly, chair legs scraping. This is a mistake, he said, louder than necessary. No one reacted. Authority without backing sounds different. He gathered his things with stiff movements, papers sliding into his bag without order, and left the room without another word. The door closed behind him softly, which somehow made it worse. No applause followed, no relief, just a collective exhale as people recalculated what this meant for them. The meeting moved on, because institutions always do. Next steps were assigned, deadlines set, communications planned. I was asked to remain after. When the room cleared, the chair turned to me. Your name will be cleared, she said, publicly. I nodded once. Your team as well, she added. They were collateral. That mattered more than anything else she could have said. When I stepped back onto the floor, the news had already traveled. People looked up as I passed, some with curiosity, some with something like apology, none brave enough to say it out loud. His office was dark, a facilities tag hung from the handle. By the end of the day, his nameplate was gone. I returned to my desk and finished what I'd been working on before all of this began, closed the file and logged out. The collapse wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no public spectacle, just a quiet, procedural removal that stripped power down to its absence. Walking to my car, I understood, something that hadn't been clear before. The moment they tried to destroy my credibility, they handed me the only leverage that ever really works: evidence. And once that entered the room, control didn't explode. It evaporated. The days that followed moved faster than the weeks before it, as if once the balance tipped, everything that had been held in place by denial finally slid forward at once. An internal notice went out clearing my name and the team's, brief and factual, the kind of message designed to correct the record without drawing attention to how wrong it had been. Meetings multiplied, then reorganized themselves around new names and temporary titles. People I hadn't heard from in years suddenly wanted context, perspective, reassurance. I answered what mattered and declined what didn't. The work itself didn't pause. Accounts still had to be reconciled. Vendors still expected answers. But the atmosphere shifted from suspicion to exposure, and that carried its own weight. Files were requested, reviewed, re-reviewed. Processes that had once relied on trust were rebuilt around verification. A few colleagues disappeared quietly, desks cleared overnight, calendars wiped without explanation. Others stayed and worked longer hours, trying to prove distance from what had happened. I was asked to sit in on planning sessions, to advise on controls, to explain how gaps form when people stop asking uncomfortable questions. I did it because it was necessary, not because it felt rewarding. Every contribution came with a reminder of how close I'd come to being erased for doing the same job. One afternoon, I was called into a private room with senior leadership and offered a role that would formalize what I'd already been doing. More authority, more visibility, a chance to help rebuild trust from the inside. The offer was framed as recognition, but the timing made its own case. They needed stability, and I represented proof that the system could correct itself. I asked for time to consider, which surprised them. The assumption had been gratitude. Instead, I went back to my desk and watched the floor settle into a new rhythm that didn't include the old center of gravity. Conversations were more cautious now. Decisions were documented more thoroughly. People asked permission where they once assumed it. The fallout wasn't loud, but it was everywhere. Outside the building, clients requested explanations that were carefully worded and selectively honest. Some contracts paused, others demanded amendments. The reputation hit was real, measurable, and not something a single appointment could fix. Internally, the team I'd worked with began to recover in uneven ways. Some wanted to move on quickly, bury the memory under normalcy. Others needed to talk through what it felt like to be suspected without cause. I listened when asked and stayed quiet when not. Leadership isn't always about speaking. Sometimes it's about not repeating the same mistake with different words. Toward the end of the week, I walked past the conference room where it had started and noticed the door propped open, sunlight cutting across the table. The screen was blank. No numbers, no red, just an empty space waiting to be used for something else. That image stayed with me longer than the meeting itself. The collapse had resolved the immediate threat, but it left a larger question in its place. Staying would mean becoming part of the story the company told about its recovery. Leaving would mean carrying the truth without needing to soften it. When I finally gave my answer, it wasn't dramatic. I declined the role, thanked them for the opportunity, and stated my terms for departure clearly and professionally. They accepted without pushback. By then, they understood that control works best when it's mutual. On my last day, I packed my things methodically, returned my badge, and walked out through the same doors I'd entered every morning without thinking. The building didn't look different, but I did. The fallout had done what the accusation couldn't. It forced a reckoning that stripped away illusions and left only choices. What came next would be built elsewhere, with the same discipline, but without the need to prove anything to people who had already shown how easily trust can be traded for convenience. The morning I left, there was no announcement and no gathering, which was exactly how I wanted it. I arrived early when the floor was quiet and the lights were still warming up, and took one last look around a space that had taught me more than it ever intended to. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires an audience. What I felt instead was precise. I reviewed my exit documents, confirmed the final transfers, and sent a short message to the people who mattered, thanking them for their professionalism and wishing them well. No explanations, no closing speech. The work had already spoken. As the day progressed, I met briefly with a few colleagues who stopped by, each interaction careful and respectful, as if everyone understood that this ending didn't need commentary. One asked what I would do next. I answered honestly without detail. "Build something clean," I said. That was enough. By midday, my desk was clear. I returned the keys, logged out of the systems, and signed the final acknowledgement. When I handed over my badge, the security lead nodded and said, "Good luck." It didn't sound routine. It sounded earned. Walking through the lobby, I passed the conference room again. Someone else was inside now, talking through a deck, gesturing at a screen. The company would keep going. They always do. Systems adapt, stories get rewritten. What mattered was that my name was no longer part of a convenient version of events. Outside, the air felt lighter than I expected. I paused at the curb, not to look back, but to take inventory. I had my reputation intact, my records complete, and my autonomy restored. That combination is rare, and it doesn't come from winning arguments. It comes from refusing to surrender facts. In the weeks that followed, I didn't rush to replace what I'd left. I set up a small operation, selective by design, focused on helping organizations build controls before they become crisis responses. The calls came steadily, some from people who'd heard what happened, others from leaders who recognized the pattern too late and didn't want to repeat it. I chose carefully. Power, I'd learned, doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly through consistency. Occasionally, someone would ask if I regretted not staying, not taking the position that had been offered. I never did. Staying would have meant inheriting a narrative that wasn't mine to carry. Leaving allowed me to define the terms of what came next. That distinction mattered. Months later, I ran into a former colleague at a conference. We exchanged pleasantries, then a pause. "You changed things," he said finally. I shook my head. "Things were already changing," I replied. "I just stopped absorbing the damage." That's the part people miss. This wasn't about revenge or proving someone wrong. It was about recognizing the moment when compliance turns into complicity and choosing not to cross that line. Quiet professionals don't lack strength. We lack tolerance for chaos disguised as authority. When pushed far enough, we don't shout, we document, we wait. And when the moment arrives, we act in ways that can't be undone. If there's a lesson here, it isn't inspirational, it's practical. Keep records, ask questions, pay attention to patterns. And if you ever find yourself being publicly blamed for something you didn't create, understand this. The attempt to humiliate you is rarely the end. It's the beginning of a test you didn't ask for but can still pass. Walking away on your own terms isn't losing. Sometimes it's the only outcome that actually belongs to you. I didn't walk away from that experience feeling victorious. I walked away quieter, slower, and more aware of what actually carries weight when things turn hostile. What surprised me wasn't the accusation. It was how unprepared so many smart people were once the room turned cold. I learned that power doesn't panic when it's loud. It panics when it meets records that don't bend. The strength that carried me through wasn't confidence or charisma. It was patience. It was the habit of saving drafts, keeping dates, writing things down when no one thought it mattered. While others trusted memory and titles, I trusted paper trails. That choice cost time. It cost sleep. It cost being liked. But it gave me something no meeting could take back. Proof. Quiet strength doesn't look impressive in the moment. It looks boring. It looks careful. It looks like staying late to label files no one asked for. But when pressure hits, that preparation becomes leverage. If I were talking to a friend who felt invisible at work, I'd say this: don't confuse being quiet with being powerless. Don't wait for permission to protect yourself. Keep your own timeline. Save your own copies. Ask calm questions in writing. And when something feels off, don't argue yet. Observe. Prepare. Let the facts do the talking. I didn't win because I was louder. I won because I was ready when silence finally broke. How to get started today. Save original versions of important work before changes. Keep dates, names, and decisions in one private place. Follow up key conversations with short written summaries. Notice patterns instead of isolated mistakes. Protect your work even when everything seems fine. Thanks for staying with me through this. These situations feel personal, but they're more common than we admit, and there's more to uncover.